Pastor Mark Fishburne on Friday, May the 29th, with our Friday edition of Ministry Minutes. We've been looking, if you've been following along, in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 these last couple of weeks, looking specifically at our responsibility as the ministers of God, and specifically a responsibility of how we respond in times of difficulty, in times of challenges. And here in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, just a quick review, it says in verse 1, "When we then as workers together with him beseech you that you receive not the grace of God in vain." Verse 3 says, "Giving no offense in anything, that the ministry be not blamed." And then he says, "But in all things approving ourselves as the ministers of God in," and then he gives an extensive list. And this list is what we've been going through, taking one word at a time through this list and trying to gain a little encouragement perhaps, or a little better understanding of exactly the situations. He's talking about how we can respond as believers, so God's testimony is not hindered or harmed when times of difficulty come. And so it says, in all things, approving ourselves as the ministers of God, all of that's, he's talking to all believers here, okay? We're all ministers of God, in much patience, in afflictions, in necessities, in distresses. We looked at all of those words individually and looked a little bit behind what those words really mean and how, again, we can get through those difficult times in our life with a proper Christian testimony. And then in verse 5 goes on, in stripes. We looked at that on Tuesday. And so today he says in imprisonments. Now just to remind you again real quick, we know who's writing here to the Corinthian church. It's the Apostle Paul. And many of the disciples knew what it meant to be in prison, but Paul certainly knew what it meant to be in prison, didn't he? And we know that Paul, regardless of circumstances, gave praise to God. And you remember the instance when they were in prison, and it said they prayed, but it says they praised God and sang songs at midnight. Paul was not under some false sense of illusion. He knew that they very well their heads could be on the chopping block the next morning. They could be put to death. But they had such a confidence in God, such a joy in the ministry. We talked a little about that last time, about having joy in times of stripes or times of persecution. But Paul knew what it was to be in prison. And then I got to thinking about all through the book of Acts, and you can look through and follow through, but how every time when Paul was arrested for preaching the gospel of Christ and he was in prison, something I've never experienced. I've never been in prison for preaching the gospel of Christ. And I doubt if anyone who's watching, at least here in the States, has been in prison strictly for preaching the gospel of Christ. I guess in recent days there's been a little bit of some things on that front. But nevertheless, he says in imprisonment, Paul, all through the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul, every time he's brought before a magistrate, before Festus, for example, and before all those rulers as he was taken from place to place, the very first thing Paul talks about, the very first thing, and you can look it up and see that I'm right, all right? Every time he immediately begins not with, "What do you think you're doing? How can you do this to me? I'm the Apostle Paul." And he didn't do any of that. He didn't whine and complain and mope and groan, moan and groan. Every time he had an opportunity to speak before authorities, to speak before magistrates, he shared his testimony. He talked about where he had come from and how Christ had changed his life. And if we could learn just a little bit of that from the life of the Apostle Paul, that when tough times do come, and we may or may not face imprisonment for preaching the gospel, but when tough times do come, and the toughest of times, not knowing what tomorrow holds, again, maybe the very end of our life, as the Apostle Paul, again, didn't have reassurance of the next day as he was going through all these things. But may we have just a little bit of that understanding, or a little bit of that taken to heart of the testimony of the Apostle Paul, that whenever there's an opportunity, whatever we go through, there is an opportunity to minister for God, for Christ, and to share the gospel of Christ, the message, the good news of Jesus Christ, Basically, just sharing what he's done, as the Apostle Paul did, sharing what he's done in your life. And the greater, we mentioned this a couple of times ago, but the greater the challenge, the greater the difficulty that you're facing, the greater the valley, the greater the chance, or the greater the opportunity, rather, that God can be magnified. And we, in times of distress, times of difficulty, we have opportunities placed before us that we would never otherwise have. We've seen this with this pandemic that's going around. Opportunities for people to hear the gospel that otherwise would never have heard the gospel, never have stepped inside the church. The church is important, and we need to be in church and all of that. But God can use those times of difficulty to reach people that otherwise would never be reached. When you're in the hospital or when you're going through difficulties, you can have people that you can minister to that you otherwise would never have opportunity to reach. And so may our focus, again, always be on that aspect that we are ministers of Christ. No matter where we are, no matter what we're going through, we're to be His representative and sharing the message of the saving gospel of Jesus Christ. Have a good day, and we will see you back here Tuesday for another edition of Ministry Minutes.